At the beginning of the 18th century, China was under the rule of the Qing dynasty, and the Qianlong Emperor adopted a closed border policy. There were few Chinese immigrants to the United States. On the other side of the ocean, the United States is in the process of the first industrial revolution, needed new resources, and along with their curiosity about Eastern civilizations, they continued to explore. Several American marches bought a Chinese woman and brought her back to the United States. The girl's name was Mei. She was the first known Chinese female immigrant in the United States and has been exhibited as a product in various American cities since 1834. Nowadays, this history has been adopted into a play and is still performed throughout the United States.
It is human nature to be curious. Curiosity is evolution.
This play, the Chinese lady Moi always sits in the middle of the room, which was represented as a shipping container, and then becomes the room in the museum. These are the words that books in Moi and her interpret Aton's cultural identities.
We see Moi repeatedly within this room, and she talks about the room and the decorations, but then we're constantly jumping through time. So there was a key concept that we talked about in terms of a time machine. Like, what is it like to start out in 24, and then we jump 10 years ahead, we jump 20 years ahead, and then at the end we're at 2022. You're at the end, you're really feeling that the time has passed, that we're traveling through time even though nobody moved anywhere.
In the first half of the play, the audience could see Moi walk backstage to change her costume. However, in the second half, Moi gradually took off her costume. According to the production team, this implies how Moi gets rid of all the cultural burden and get freedom.
What does it mean to start out with Moi wearing so much stereotypes? Because she was put here to put Chinese culture on display. Whenever we think about putting Chinese culture on display, it's like exaggerated Chinese culture that isn't sort of so fitting for her at the moment. But when she is liberated from all those things, she's really like peeled off to reveal her true self. This concept of embodying liberation and stereotype at the same time, like throughout time, to strike things down.
We want to indicate that at the beginning she was packaged in a way for the foreign audience, but slowly she revealed herself, and then at the end she's kind of like get rid of all the burdens on her, and then like stop to serving any purpose for this play itself, but like kind of reveal what she really is, and then also set liberation of herself, because all this costume can be considered as a burden and also a structure, and then at the end she can get loose and get freedom.
Due to the disparate gender ratios of early Chinese immigrants, the early Chinese immigrants community were more like a bachelor society. The sight of a Chinese woman was cause for wonder.
You have these sort of individual acts of violence, right, throughout like the American West, and that goes to kind of fuel an anti-Chinese movement, a political movement, right, which will eventually lead to the passage of the first immigration law that we have in this country called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Right? You might have heard of that. And so this is the very first immigration law that we have, right? It's still the only law that actually names a specific group for exclusion. Prior to that, we had actually passed something called the Page Law, which basically came to restrict immigration of Chinese women. So that's part of the reason why that there is this sort of gender disparity between the sort of early immigration settlement in the early population, Chinese population in the United States. It's many more men than women. That and also the sort of labor demand. So those various kinds of factors. There's a big gender disparity. It also made them quite vulnerable to these kinds of anti-Chinese movements, right? Because they could point to the Chinese and say, "Oh, look how abnormal they are."
If we look at Moi's story and look at her journey itself, it's essentially an American story. It's much less about what China was like. It's much more about sort of what a foreign person or any young woman who's outside of America.
I don't think this show intends to just tell the story of Afomoy. Afomoy is a representation of all the Asian American women and all the Asian American community. She is the collection, but like the history, you know, it's like a breakdown. And she becomes the representation because she was so special in the beginning. And towards the end of the show, she becomes the one who's being irrelevant. And that moment, she becomes the, you know, she was like every one of us.
But despite the fact that 200 years have passed, it is believed that the issues still exist.
The moment and how it felt like to live in America, which is deeply still kind of entrenched in systematic racism and stereotypes, and sort of what it's like to thrive as a woman, kind of among all of those, especially right now when there's so much violence happening to Boston's Chinatown, to Chinatown around the country, to Asian American women around the country, to elders around the country, sort of bringing a little bit of that trauma and like really tapping into how we feel like and how we identify in this current moment, and like embracing both the pride and the pain at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's been clear in this time, especially when prejudices and in xenophobia and hate crimes, I mean, we see increasing. And I think the othering, you know, just viewing people as sort of other and just like different, I think that's definitely been increased in the last few years.
I do think it's still an issue. I mean, I think I learned a lot about Chinese American history that I wasn't taught in the public school system, and obviously there's still a lot of discrimination that happens against Chinese and Asian American people. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think the Chinese lady brings a lot of that again to forefront of mind. And
just this year, you know, all of the Asian hate crimes that have been happening, you know, and largely go unreported and not talked about. I think that there's a lot of cultural understanding in America that we still struggle with to understand how to acknowledge so many people with such different cultures and how they can all exist in one place respectfully, non-violently.
I think that these issues still exist in a very different way. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about the fact that, like, you know, we are sitting in a mostly white audience watching this show that is like a representation of like the Chinese lady, but like in many ways still thinking about like, you know, like what are these audience members still thinking when they're viewing this, like those questions that come up throughout the play about like what the white people who were seeing Afomoy back 200 years ago, what they were thinking and how they were like viewing her as this commodity, like what is different now.
Audience is multiracial. Maybe the audience is diverse. A lot of the audience is white themselves. A lot of audience here grew up in Boston, and you know, it's fully white, you know, European American. And how do we convey and the fullness of that story, but also at the same time they're staring at us? And that's a little bit of discomfort. And how do we deal with that? That's, I think, one of the things that we have to think a lot about.
I think the biggest perspective it gave me is definitely on like how we appreciate and understand language barriers, and in the translation process, what poetry can be lost. And I think that was a really beautiful point for me. And yeah, I also like in general just like learned a lot about Chinese American history, especially during like the Gold Rush and Exclusion Act and everything like that. So a lot of perspective gained.
I think it is just for humans, right? It's just so critically important that we do see each other and not just look through our sort of filters, right? But just maybe see each person.